Hi, I want to welcome everybody back to Serenbe Stories. And Steve is with us again. Today is just the two of us, and we are going to talk about all the details that matter.
If there is a large porch, many times people will use it, especially in the evening or early morning. And that just seemed like an essential part to bring that authentic community together and to try to connect people in a meaningful way.
Steve, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, Steve, when people visit Serenbe, we get a lot of questions that people can't quite put their finger on it of what are the things that make them feel so good about being here, that there's a real difference. And I think of it as it comes down to the details. We talk a lot about everything is everything. And at Serenbe, people tend to have a feeling of calmness. Something's happening to them. And I think nature is a huge part of it and how everything has been sort of set within nature. But I also think that we are so used to a lot of, visual pollution or cacophony of sounds or monotony of place in suburbs or cities sometimes. But I would love to hear just your high level thoughts before we dig into what those details are. What do you think are the differences, or what kind of questions do you get asked when people show up at Serenbe?
Well, Monica, years ago, when I finally realized that I was going to be a developer, I really started thinking about that in obviously a different way. And I thought about the places that I remembered or that I felt comfortable in. And I discovered it wasn't always the places that had the wow effect, maybe, as I went back and looked at them. It was the places that looked authentic. Many times that tended to be older places, but it didn't necessarily have to be the age. And I really started studying the difference between a planned development that we've seen in the last several decades and towns that developed over time. And I realized that was one of the largest differences. Many times the planned developments, if you will, or any areas that are new, they tend to work what I would think of as too hard and make them too perfect. And thus it feels perfect, but not necessarily authentic. And so this was a very delicate balance and remains a delicate balance always. And I think of the influence that Ryan Gainey had on my life as far as landscaping. And of course, Ryan is known for writing the book, The Well-Placed Weed. His gardens were always charming. His personal garden was the only one that was annually on the Atlanta Botanical Garden Show, and it was always the number one. And when you look carefully, there were weeds. It was not perfect in an absolute world thought, but people could relate to it because it looked authentic and they felt comfortable in it. And so as we've set about making decisions at Serenbe, I've really tried to take that approach. And I think that makes a huge difference.
No, I think that's a really good point. I'll say, what is a weed, right? I think that's something that I learned from learning about Ryan. It's just a label that we've placed on it. And so some of those things we do want to cultivate, right? Or wild plants that can be more meadow-like versus lawns we talk a lot about. You do hear that too perfect. It's almost like a Disneyfication. Love Disneyland, but it's a very specific, curated, organized space. And those perfect lawns and the perfect fencing and all those things that some of these resort communities are absolutely gorgeous. But I think you're right. They're perfectly manicured, and feels a little too perfect. One of the things that really struck me when we first moved were the lampposts. Can you tell us a little bit about those, and really the street signs and the street furniture? Because that is very unusual.
It is. As we were looking to be authentic and also to honor artists and craftsmen, the street light was one of the things that just popped out at me because our civil engineers gave me the books that we should choose a streetlight from, and they all looked like just standard streetlights that you see a lot of places. And I asked for more books and unique books, and I found unique streetlights really didn't exist. I decided we should create our own. And of course, everyone said you couldn't do that. And I found out that you really could. It's just no one did because there were regulations you had to go through. And so we commissioned the artist, Robert Rausch, to design a streetlight in Selborne. And the commercial focus in Selborne is the arts. And so we wanted something that was not only designed by an artist, but related in some way to the arts and could be actually stand by itself as a piece of art. And we went through many, many sketches and renderings and even a paper mache mold of the streetlight. These things, it's not obvious. I was nervous until actually the second one was installed, because we were really out there on the edge when you thought of streetlights.
Mm-hmm.
That has really set a tone now that in each community we have a different streetlight that relates to the commercial intent of that hamlet.
Do you find that now that you've done it, there are other developers who have emulated that or have looked to do more unique street furniture and lighting?
I have seen some, but I'm not aware of people who've actually commissioned artists and gone to kind of the extent we have. Several more combinations of pieces and parts.
Yeah, and I think it does make a difference. And I think it sort of sets a tone, like you're saying, and a nod to the experience that you're going to have here. Did you feel like that was something that came out of hospitality by creating a more unique placemaking experience? Because the granite curbs are another one that really weren't used regularly in planned developments until you kind of re-instigated with the city of Atlanta, we should be doing this again.
Well, here again, as we wanted to be authentic, I noticed places decades ago all had granite curbs. We have granite quarries in Georgia, and so that seemed like a natural product. And we set about to do that. It just seemed like the right thing to do. Of course, when we were getting our final plans approved, I found that that was a roadblock, not because the county administrators didn't like the idea. It's that no one had installed a granite curb in a new community in the last 30 years. It'd be 40 years or 50 years now. So they didn't have a proper installation recorded in your approval books. And so we had to get our engineers to send our installation profile in, and then that had to be approved and entered into Fulton County's official installation for granite curbs.
And do you find that that's sometimes the challenge, is that the policy isn't there, or maybe the city plan isn't there? And once you change it, then anybody can go ahead and use granite curbs because it's been specified. Is that something that's easy to do, that developers can do in other cities, or residents can start to ask for those changes in their city?
Well, gosh, Monica, I was so naive as a developer in what you couldn't do. And so we set about to do all these great things that were visually and environmentally we just saw the absolute. And to my surprise, 50% of what you see at Serenbe today was not allowed 20 years ago. Of course, changing all the zoning for the overlay allowed things like live works and 500 square foot houses and all these things that we do not see commercial across from single family, all those things. That was in one sweeping overlay. But then there were so many things like the light fixtures and the granite curbs and buried power lines and no lawns and leaving the topography as it was rather than grading it flat for ease and leaving trees 5 feet from the foundation. I mean, it was just unbelievable. From simple to complicated in stormwater, how we dealt with stormwater. And so it was a challenge. But I was not a developer, nor doing this from the perspective of being a developer. This started as an effort to save the rural area this close to Atlanta. And all of a sudden, as I stepped through that threshold of passion to develop the land to show how you could have balanced growth, I found myself in all these conversations and regulations.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunate because of my investment in Midtown Atlanta in the 70s, I was able to use those real estate holdings to do Serenbe. So I didn't have the interest clock ticking. And I understand why many well-intended developers simply can't fight the battles, can't ask the questions, because time is money and they can't take that extra month, that extra thought that they might not get an approval for 60, 90, 120 days.
Yeah, that is interesting. Do you think that they could, and this is probably getting in the weeds for some people, but do you think that developers and landowners and planners can go to the city and do that work before the clock sort of ticking on that interest loan? Or is that all bundled together when you're doing a project?
No, you absolutely can. And some people are doing that and they are more aware. I had no idea that there were so many roadblocks to being environmentally or visually interesting. That seemed just counterproductive. But that absolutely is the case. And we're finding many are bringing their regulators to Serenbe to show the example. And so that makes it easier if there is an example you point to. In many cases, we had trouble finding local examples.
Right. And so now at least you can be, or Serenbe can be, some of that model for people to sort of point to and say, hey, it worked, or hey, it's been done, or what about trying this? And I think that's exciting to be able to share that. And, one reason why we're doing this episode is to really share some of these ideas and solutions with the broader public. We talked about a little bit the granite curbs and lampposts and street signs, other things that people don't notice, but it would very much affect how you feel or move through the space of Serenbe, which is a very mundane thing, trash cans, right? When I lived in Grant Park, we had our Herbie Kirby and we had to pull it down to the street every whatever Tuesday, or Midtown, or wherever you are, pretty much many, many places around the country. But you didn't do that. You didn't want them. So what did you do instead?
Visual pollution was as troubling to me as the environment and everything else. And so when I thought about trash, the big Herbie Kirby's is just a visual problem. Somebody always goes on vacation and leaves it out and what have you. And then the noisy trucks that come into the community is a problem. And so as we looked at examples and what could be done, we found that old communities, there was such a thing as a buried trash can. And if we had our own service, we could actually handle this for less money by collecting it. It was more of a personal experience, and it's visually almost not there. As people drive down the streets, they don't see our trash cans because they're a buried lid near the front usually. And we collect them with a small vehicle that's not noisy. And that's taken to what we call roll off on the edge of the property. We have a yard that holds the recycling and the trash. Then the big trucks come and get that on a weekly schedule. And then we're able to take our compost to the farm. So it makes it easier for people to put their compost and their recycling all in the same place their trash goes. So it makes sense on a lot of areas.
Two questions to follow up. One, you mentioned older communities. Where were those communities that you saw that you were inspired with buried trash cans? That's super interesting.
I believe Smyrna, for one, right here in Metro Atlanta.
Smyrna, who knew?
And I'm not sure if they still do, but 20 years ago they did.
That's so cool. Well, and the other thing I hadn't really ever thought about is the consolidation. One of the things that's also sort of a detail is the post offices, or the post where I go get our mail, right? Where we get our mail is consolidated to post houses or stations, if you will. We have 4 or 5 of them throughout the community. And so you, as your pocket neighborhood, you go to the little post house. And so that is energy efficient for the post person. They're not having to stop and start at every house. It's all consolidated. So that saves energy from a gas and carbon emitting. But I would think that the actual pollution, same thing with the trash guys, is that you're not using these huge sort of industrial trucks to stop and start at every house. They're coming into one place and then they're leaving. And that to me, I had never thought about, but that's a benefit as well.
Exactly.
One of the things as we're talking about like homes and placement of the cans, the other thing that is probably more people may know about just because we've been in the press for it. Country Living called us the porch capital. I think Reader's Digest said that it was a unique thing that all the houses are required to have some form of porch and it's pulled very close to the street. Where did you get that idea to have those houses sit closer to the street? And we all have sidewalks here. What was that philosophy?
You look at any town developed prior to 1930, you'll see that condition. I lived in Midtown Atlanta at 6th and Myrtle, and every house had a porch. They were all pulled close to the street. And we would take walks after dinner and talk to neighbors on the porch. With the air conditioning, people don't use the porches like they used to. And so the porches disappeared. But it's also disconnected us from the community in many ways. But if there is a large porch, many times people will use it, especially in the evening or early morning. And that just seemed like an essential part to bring that authentic community together and to try to connect people in a meaningful way. And we really saw how important that was during the pandemic because we did not lose those connections. Our kids were able to stay in touch with classmates by simply walking down the street and waving and talking to their classmates that were at a safe distance on the porch. That was the same for the adults. And I think we saw how important connections were as people were forced back into their communities. And those communities where porches had disappeared. I've heard stories of people pulling their lawn chairs from the backyard out to their driveways in the front yard simply for those connections that front porches provide.
One of the other things I think is interesting about the houses is Serenbe has a design review, two of them, one for the landscape and one for the homes. And I wanted to talk about that. It's not just the architecture, right? So the architecture is very specific, but talk a little bit about how the houses are set on the land and how the ridge caps, the tops of the houses, speak to each other. What's the philosophy there and where does that idea come from?
We realize that how houses flow give you what you feel. My time living in Midtown Atlanta and then Ansley Park, it really taught me a lot about placement and massing. Ansley Park was developed in the early 1900s. And then during the 1980s, some people started tearing down houses here and there. And I specifically remember when a traditional Tudor house, I believe it was torn down, and the approval was for a very contemporary house. And there was a lot of folks up in arms. And that house was built basically in the same footprint as the house that had been there before. And it was about the same size in height by massing. I mean, you know, how high and the presence it had to the street. And it looked fine and people liked it. And we saw other times that people tore houses down or added onto them and they became bigger and awkward. And even if they were the same architecture. And so I realized how the houses flow on the street. And so we have that gradual change. And Phil Tabb brought the whole concept of transects, which really helps us give it a pattern that as we move from a rural transect, a rural area where there are no houses, and we come into the first area, we call it the first transect of housing. And in those areas, we place the houses back from the street and there are no curbs. And then as you move in closer to the center of our hamlets or the developed area, we start pulling the houses in closer. And so, for instance, in Selborne, you'll see on the right, if you're coming in from the wildflower meadow, those houses are stepping up from the stream. And your first house is a one-story, about 2.5 feet below grade, which is something you rarely see today, but you see in any condition pre-1930. And then on that side, each house sits up a little higher. and comes a little closer to the front sidewalk. On the opposite side, those houses are on the hill and they step down from the hill. So by the time you get to the next intersection, the houses start to feel like an urban wall. And the ridge caps, the roofs, gradually are getting a couple feet bigger as it goes. And by doing it in this way, in a little over a quarter mile, we've gone from a one-story house below grade to a four-story live work, and it feels very natural. Now, if you go into areas where you have a two-story next to a three-story and a one-story, it's sort of these sawtooth look, and it just doesn't feel as calm or pleasant.
That is interesting. And there's also sort of a sense of discovery with the streets. And that's not so much the transect, but the way the streets are laid out. Serenbe is not in a grid pattern, which is wonderful for cities, very simple, numbered. You're in New York, it completely helps you with wayfinding. But we don't really have a grid with our streets. Can you talk a little bit about why that is and what that sense of discovery that happens because of the way they're laid out?
Yes, we really wanted to respond to the natural environment and the topography. And Phil Tabb, who did his doctorate on the English Village, really led this effort. And if you're in England, you'll see that it isn't necessarily the grid. It can be, but many times your villages and hamlets out in the country might have followed the cow paths, and the cow paths and the horse paths usually followed the ridge that made sense with your stormwater. And so as we really started honing in on a plan, and of course we at first were thinking the beautiful hilltops of Serenbe that we would develop there. But then when we realized that if we did that, we would be cutting the tree canopy that people saw and replacing with houses and roofs, and that it would be much more appealing if we nestled the houses down in the valley. And when we looked at doing that, because of our rainfall, we have a lot of smaller tributaries. And so we had to deal with this stream coming through the natural landscape. And suddenly it became a very natural thing to put what we call an omega in. And if you have been to the Amalfi Coast, there's a perfect place where they had to deal with the topography. And those are all omegas. You don't think about it around the little bays. And when you really start looking at places that are centuries old, they responded to nature in the same way. And you see these horseshoe omega shapes in many places. So it's not that unique. But we also realized we wanted a pedestrian community, which many of those places are. And so there is a pedestrian grid, but a wandering street.
Before, because I do want to talk about the trails, and you're right, there is that sort of pedestrian grid and trails that cut across those omegas. But one of the things that I think is always kind of a funny thing is, how do you name streets? Because I've had a couple conversations with you guys over time as things have gotten named, and it's not as simple or easy as we think. Can you tell us, like, how does that process work if I'm building a community and I have to go to the city or Fulton County, the county, and give them my street names? Like, there's a lot of requirements around it.
There are. You have to have, number one, a name that doesn't relate to other names in the general area. So all your emergency vehicles aren't going to be confused. And so that is a huge piece that you have to deal with. You have to get creative, but at the same time, we didn't want to look like a development where you see these places that name all their streets after a flower or all their streets after a fruit. So we wanted something that has some authentic meaning to us. Our main street that snakes through the community is obviously Serenbe Lane. But the first street, which doesn't connect all the hamlets, we decided to call that Selborne because it was Selborne, England, that influenced so much of what we've done. So our two main streets really are Selborne and Serenbe.
Yeah, I love that. And I do think it's interesting that they have to be, you can't duplicate, and you have to get kind of creative sometimes to do it.
And many people don't realize that we have three streets named after our three daughters. So Garnet Ridge is after Garney. Q Loop is obviously Quinn, and Augusta Lane is Kara's middle name.
That's right. And you've got one named after, there's Tab, named after Phil Tab, and then Ryan Gainey Lane.
That's correct. And Rausch Ridge is Robert Rausch, the artist on all the streetlights. So we've really used the street names to honor people who've had a key influence, and their thumbprint is all over Serenbe. And so this is a way to recognize this more permanently.
Let's talk about the trails. We sort of started the conversation talking about Ryan Gainey and the well-placed weed. And I do think that it is something where so many places are trying to control nature and put it in its box. And that would be included a lawn. I mean, I grew up in a suburb that had big old lawns in front of the houses, and it looks beautiful. And we know the challenges with lawns. But I think that so much of what we're doing, I really liked how you said responding to nature, because we really talked about building with and connecting people to nature. But I like that responding with nature because it feels like more of a reciprocal relationship. I think most people know at this point that 70% of the land is saved. We build densely on the remaining 30. Of that 70, it's green space, including a farm or a field. It couldn't be a playground, but it could be a soccer field. Is that right?
Well, it depends on the definition of a playground, but a much simpler thing to think about it, because we're talking about a regulation for 40,000 acres. So this is the entire overlay for the county initially, and then the city of Chad Hills. And so the simple way to think about it is we can disturb 30% for housing and commercial. And the 70% has to remain for anything that could be approved in agricultural zoning. And so that's basically, grass fields. So a soccer field could be considered a grass field when you think about it. If the playground is really organized, not so. Of course, I think of playgrounds as the treehouse out in the middle of the woods, and not as a fenced playground that has to be in the regulations next to the school. That could not count as open space.
Well, and I know that you speak of your 7 years in the wilderness when you retired before you started developing Serenbe. You went out and just started cutting trails, and you knew a lot of the creeks were there. But there's a major creek called Cedar Creek that is here, that has been here. But tell me about the tributaries, because you've recently named some of the tributaries. Tell me a little bit about the experience of cutting the trails, how important they are to the community, and then naming the tributaries, because you don't have to go through anybody to name those tributaries, right? Because it's on your land.
That's right. In what's referred to as my 7 years in the wilderness, the 6 of that was my first 6 years in retirement. And then that 7th year of retirement was that year that I was like, oh, what do we do to save this land? So when you're trying to match up the timelines, that's how that is. So it was actually a year into this concern that I realized I was going to be a developer. But in those years, I was fortunately 49 years old when we sold the company and we moved full time to the farm. And we started putting in the gardens, and I was quite active. And as we added property, we started with 60 acres. It was mostly pasture. And then we put the old farm back together. There were some old trails and old timber trails that had overgrown. And so I reopened those. And then as we started adding more land, a neighboring piece, the old Shell property came available. Then I had to figure out, how do I connect our trails to some old trails that they had, and how do we open those? And I had a big Massey Ferguson, and I would go out and climb trees to try to figure out where a trail was going, and tie red tape on these trees, and then get on my Massey Ferguson and try to follow those tapes. So some of those old trails kind of wandered here and there, and that was because I maybe lost my direction out in the woods. And Cedar Creek really confused the heck out of me, because I didn't really realize on our property that it ran south, and then in other places it ran north, and it ran east, and it ran west. It practically goes in circles. And that was very confusing when you're out there thinking it's all running southwest towards the Chattahoochee. And it eventually did, but it took a meandering path to do that. And we do have the tributaries. And as we've developed and have footpaths against some of them, we realized that it was getting exhausting and confusing to try to describe which tributary we're talking about. So we recently named them. And the main one that comes through Selborne and creates our two waterfalls on its way to Cedar Creek, we have named that Peak Creek after the Peak family. And they remain our neighbors today. The overlay is secured that they can stay on their farmland that is there. And the 8th generation is now being raised on this land. So that's fun. And that creek actually comes up out of the ground on the edge of their property. Another is Shell Stream, and that is after the Shell family. They were major property owners in the area, and a lot of what is now Grange was the Shell property. And many Shell people are in the general area. And in fact, Simon Shell built our rural studio houses at the art farm, and he's doing some other work at Serenbe. So it's fun to have the generational families involved in various ways in the Serenbe area. The small stream that runs from the back of the inn, we've named that for the Barnes family. And they're the ones who bought the land in 1905 that we think of as the farmhouse and the inn at Serenbe. And they built those buildings and they lived on the property for 3 generations. And the descendants are still living in the area as well. So those are 3 historical. The one stream that runs through what we call Prom Field, I'm not as familiar with the family and where that stream comes from because it comes really close to our property where it originates. And so we decided there was a lot of history to the name Prom Field. And so we've called that the Prom Field stream.
As we wrap up, definitely jump in if there's other things. We've done a whole episode on landscaping, edible, native, medicinal, but are there other questions that you get a lot about the details or that other placemakers and developers want to know that we haven't covered?
Boy, Monica, that's not a wrap-up question. That is the opening for the next conversation.
Okay, perfect. I do know, here's a wrap-up question. I do know that one question you get asked a lot by people, and maybe this is a short one, what was it like raising kids in the inn and farmhouse? That's a different detail, but one that as somebody who's raised kids here, I don't know if you want to answer that as our stepping out question.
Well, yeah, happy to. And I'm constantly thankful that I had the courage to follow my intuition. And we moved our kids to the farm when they were 6, 8, and 10. And that is a pivotal age, I think, because they were excited. At least Garney and Kara were excited. Quinn still thought the farm was dirty. And she was upset. She had lost her Barbie room and a few of those things. But they were still going along with us as parents, and it seemed really great. And it was. And they spent time out in the forest and the fields and nature. And we had been there about 4 or 5 months. And one night at dinner, I just checked in with them. Are you glad we moved to the farm? Because we had a great place in the city with the pools, and it was convenient. And we had an acre fenced yard in Ansley, which is unheard of in the city. And Garney looked at her sisters and looked back to me and said, yes, the freedom. Now, I expect them to say, yeah, we have a horse, we have bunnies, we have all these things. And it took me back that she would answer the freedom. And she says, in the city, we always knew you were looking out the window when we were in the backyard. And we could never go out the front door to ride our bicycles without an adult. And I didn't realize how uptight we were. And I especially did not realize that they noticed it. That was reinforcing to me, thank goodness, that we did that. It was just an intuition that I saw how they responded when we were at the farm on the weekend. I didn't have any logical reason, and I couldn't answer friends other than we just decided we were going to do it. And so it was years later that Richard Louve's book, Last Child in the Woods, came out. And as people sent me copies or asked if I'd seen it, and I read that, and after I finished it, I sent Richard Louve a note and said, thank you for giving voice to what I intuitively knew. And that is a movement that is affecting children And if there's anyone listening that is not familiar with the book Last Child in the Woods or the movement of Children in Nature Network, check into it if you have children or grandchildren, because it is important.
No, that's a great wrap up, because it's like the details that matter. And that is a detail that sometimes you can't put your finger on of why the kids are happy and have this increased confidence. But I definitely attribute it to the freedom and the ability to just confidently move around the neighborhood and sort of feel ownership of it, that it's their place. And I think a lot of that has to do with how you built it and the placemaking. So thank you, Steve.
Thanks. Look forward to talking more.
All right. Thank you so much. Bye, you guys.